Being able to adjust to where I live has always been a defining factor in my life. I've lived in a lot of different places. When I was about 2 years old, my parents divorced. Recently, my mom moved away, and now I have a home in Connecticut and a home in Vermont. Besides these two, I've also had my social life, and more recently, I've had my social life and school life here at Alfred State College. It's odd for me. I grew up in Connecticut, whether it was with my father or with my mother. What I consider a stable home has changed a lot in my life. Initially, I always thought that both houses were stable, and then shortly after 9/11, my father ran into some hard times. He had a lot of medical problems in conjunction with losing his job, and it was a hard time for us. I ended up taking care of him most of the time and looking after the house as well. And while all this was going on, I then considered my mother's house to be the more stable one, just because of the fact that I didn't have to deal with those problems. It's odd though, when I do return from school for breaks to see the same friends I did in high school. Even just hanging out at a friend's house can seem like a fun activity because of how commonplace it is. But if there's one thing in my life my father is responsible for that I've always considered consistent, it's been my love of tea. My dad was born in England and moved to the US when he was a child of about 6, but was still raised in a very British household. As I grew up, whenever anything was stressful or we were having a quiet, small celebration for some trivial task, we'd always sit down and enjoy a cup of tea together. Breakfast, dinner, didn't matter. This is something I've carried with me through my life everywhere I've lived. Now that's not to say that my mother's house doesn't have its flaws as well. For instance, it seems like people only ever hear half of what I say, such as, "Hey Eric, you should record the kitchen with a cup of tea in it for me," and instead getting a picture of a cup of tea and a video of the kitchen. Just because things don't always go as planned doesn't mean I don't enjoy spending time there. Sometimes it's nice to just be able to slow down and relax a bit. There's one thing I can certainly say, it's that the scenery is great. Just the view off of our front porch at Vermont can make hearts melt. And then when you get up onto the mountain and see the whole valley and the river, it only gets better. Now, I mentioned before how odd it is for me when I return home. Shortly before leaving for college, I found a really nice coffee shop in the town I lived in at the time of my birth until my parents' divorce, Bethel, called Molten Java. It's not a place I'd visited for most of my life growing up in Connecticut, but only found out about recently. By the same token, I also found a coffee shop in Vermont called Uncommon Grounds. So now when I return home, that's always where I end up hanging out. I invite my friends out, drive them there, sometimes even pay for their drinks if that's what it takes to get them to go with me. When I'm not going to a coffee shop with my friends, we usually end up going to the movies. It may not seem like a big deal, but Danbury, Connecticut's movie theater is one of the biggest in the area. Just looking at the parking lot, you can always tell whether or not there's a new movie playing. But even going to these coffee places, very commonly, I'll still end up getting a cup of tea. Hanging out with friends and having a cup of tea at a coffee shop seems like the most natural thing in the world. Brings together my past in Connecticut, what my father taught me, my present in Vermont, and simultaneously my present here in Alfred. Now that I've talked about my life at home, be it before college or now when I return home on visits, I want to talk a little bit about my life here in Alfred. I've got a great group of friends, and hanging out with them can make the difference between a long, boring night or a fun, productive one. When I'm done with all this work, or when I don't have anything to do, rare as it is, having a cup of tea is still one of the best ways I've found to pass the time. The dorms are certainly nicer to hang out in than my living room or kitchen at home when I'm having one of these cups of tea. And taking the time to prepare it reminds me of the stability that I saw, even if it wasn't there, when I was living at home. So you can see, living in all sorts of different places has done me a lot of good. And having something consistent, even if it is only a cup of tea, has has helped me to come to terms with the vast number of different places I've lived.